I think maybe some of the logic is a little bit apparent. We started off the day with a session which had a fair amount of theory or ideas or, attempts to frame the whole question. This group, a little more than the first group, were dealing with a set of physical realities, practical technical options, strategies for improving the environment, and in many ways a more clear understanding of how those might apply in our region to help our region continue to be a place that leads forward in these kinds of questions. I was thinking about that with Robert's very eloquent discussion of North American trends that have been a virus across the globe, but at the same time Cascadia has for 30 years or more provided a service of trying to demonstrate that there is an alternative. I was also thinking how complicated this question is because to some extent density is a big feature of that, but on the other hand we had Richard Wozni, who comes from a background of incredible experience, saying, well, there's density and then there's density and then there's density, and not all density is the same. We have the confusion also very eloquently stated and in a horrifying way of Matthew Souls, who let us know, without saying so directly, that our region stands at risk of being just yet another receptacle for the vast amounts of wealth that have accumulated just within the last 10 years in the hands of very few, and what a frightening prospect that is. I'm not sure whether I'm more scared about that prospect or the self-driven cars. Just kidding about that one, sort of. So I think it opens up a lot of questions, and I hope you have a lot of questions. As before, we can line you up at the two different microphones in the corner. If I could invite the last 7 presenters back to the stage for that. And this would be a good time for those of you who are anxious to hit the microphone to hit the microphone. So yes, take it away.
Michael Alexander. So you eliminate the annoyances of driving by having driverless cars, and you turn them into entertainment vehicles. What's the impact on land use when the land that is farther out is cheaper and now more accessible?
I think all of these questions with autonomous, all the questions that relating to autonomous vehicles are of critical importance and need to be dealt with quickly. I cannot write the papers faster than the people who are coming out with the technology. As you can see, Elon Musk on October 15th has announced that they have the equipment within the cars 2 weeks before that. So I think the technology is progressing so quickly that it's part of our job here to try and figure out what that technology means, and it's very difficult because it's destabilizing, but also it starts to change strange things. Like if you're walking down the street and they're all autonomous vehicles, you know they won't hit you. The traffic will be stopped because everyone will walk out in front of the cars, right? And so then you're like, well, where does that leave us? You know, is that more efficient or less efficient? And it's like, I'm going to go to work and then park my car in a parquet. I'm like, no, I'm not. I'm going to get dropped off at my building. My car is going to go home because I don't want to pay for UBC's parking. And then it's going to come back and get me later, which means there's twice as many cars on the street as soon as I go to work. So these are the types, and then you say, well, maybe the government should legislate that the fact that cars can't drive without someone in them. But the government isn't paying attention, right? And so then that causes a difficulty with, once the cars hit the street, then it's like, what do you post-legislate? Or you try to figure out at that point. At that point, all these private companies, as people have identified, the private companies have lots of money. The government has no money. The private company is doing all of the infrastructure investment and all of the research, and the government is doing none. then that means that you have a problem because they're going to be in charge and not the government, which may not be as good for society as it could be, never mind urban form. Sorry, that was long.
Just as somebody who's worked a little bit with Annalisa on the project and also thinks about technology specifically, one of the arguments for the autonomous vehicle is because of the amount of space that we dedicate on our road surfaces to human error, the fact that we need X amount of feet in response time and the computer doesn't necessarily need that means that the arteries may begin to shrink, that we can begin to return a lot of the surface area that's allotted to our inability to react at a certain speed and the fact that we all want to individually drive our vehicles back to the city system. So there might be an opportunity to think about reclaiming some of the land that has been given over to just tarmac in that system. I think on the other hand, maybe we need autonomous pedestrians to go with our autonomous vehicles to make sure we don't have that conflict.
I would tend to counter that argument that the increased capacity will result in less roads, because historically it's always the induced demand has always resulted in more roads. I think on the positive side, it may be safer. There will probably be less accidents.
But that's also factoring in the share economy of having shared vehicles and not everybody owning 2, 3, 4 cars per household, that you're reducing the number of cars because you don't need that for every worst case scenario trip. Like, I might run out of cheese, so I need to have a car in my garage to leave at any given moment or time. So I think that's a counterpoint.
I think that when you deal with if it's advanced technology and it requires a lot of upgrading and integration with a lot of systems, the idea of having a system that you would have a subscription to makes an awful lot of sense. And it also doesn't make sense you'd also reduce the number of cars in your household, because I would go to work, I'd send the car back, it would take my kids somewhere, it would take my husband somewhere, and then return to the house, wait for the required amount of time, and then turn up at the different locations. And so I would only have one car. And then when you say that, well, why don't you share that with other people? And as long as you keep the prestige and the image of the model, right? So you're at the highest level if you want to kind of show your prestige, then I think it might work. So that would decrease the number of cars on the road. But I think in terms of doing this research, it's a matter of setting up scenarios and extremes, doing a matrix, and then that's what we're kind of working at the moment.
Yeah. What you described wouldn't increase the vehicle miles traveled because all the trips are still being done. I think it might reduce the number of parking spaces or the number of vehicles per household.
Okay, we'll take the next question, although I'm dismayed that I can't resist the temptation to talk about, just to make mention of the fact that Copenhagen, for example, has 75% of its trips by transit, walking, and bicycle. And there is an urban form which dramatically reduces the need for that kind of mobility. So I just want to let us think about that one. And having come into the podium, which is a great power, glad I said that. And now it's you first, sir, and then that side.
So this is kind of a follow-up to the previous question, and there's a technology out there right now that allows for reduction in fatal accidents and reduction in space given over to paved surfaces, and cuts down on environmental impacts of creating cars and the recycling of them, and that's the bicycle. And more and more urban thinking is going into the reintroduction of bicycles into cities in city form. And I was somewhat dismayed at Annalisa's kind of approach to, I don't know, there's the critical kind of thought about self-driving vehicles is that, there's all these resources that are inherent, and energy inherent in the production of them, and then the maintenance of them, and the non-sustainable aspects of production of those things, whereas bicycles are already out there, and they can be shared. The consequences of an accident tends to be less serious, and it generates an urban form, I think, that is more compact by nature.
Given the number of electric scooters in China, although they're disappearing, giving way to the car, I can't imagine why we won't have a self-driving electric scooter, which might be an interesting hybrid that has some of the benefits of the bicycle and some of the benefits of the self-driving car. I would actually think that having a self-driving car would lead to more trips, because one of the things that suppresses the trips is the headaches of making the trip. If you're doing work or enjoying yourself in the car because you're not driving it, I think you'll drive more.
Okay, we'll just go to the next question. Thank you, sir.
That was a fun line of questioning because I just came back from San Francisco where I was driving beside one of Google's driverless cars. And people were sitting in the car waving their hands, and I thought, he's driving better than the other guys on the road. So anyway, my question isn't about that. This is a segue. My question in the new age of money is, who is the client? And here's a little background. Cast yourselves back to 1667, the first age of great rethinking of money in urban space, where the Great Fire of London, 1666, wiped out the middle of the city. The king contracted Sir Christopher Wren to redesign the city. He designed a thing with alleys and great vistas and great monuments and so on, and it was never built. The client was the king. The client could do that, but the king didn't do that. And why didn't he do that? Because he had just been restored to the crown 6 years earlier, and the private property owners along these routes would have their property expropriated. And it was the private property owners that had put him back into power. And he needed their continued support to remain in power. So going to Matthew's comments, which I think were phenomenally interesting to me because I don't get to think about this all the time. Who is calling the shots in urban design when there are trillions of dollars that are able to be deployed in the ways we're talking about? And we can all imagine great, wonderful cities with great bioswales and great places for people to walk and eat and so on. But who's calling the shots? Who's the client now?
I think it's a really provocative question. And I think there's a number of different ways to answer it. I think our experience from on-the-ground work in Ireland and Spain is that very often we were surprised to find government public programs that were conceived to have an effect on how the built environment was designed and constructed. And the rationale that the government decision makers, the planners and the policymakers used was based on what they perceived to be a kind of future anticipated good. And we were quite shocked how continuously we found these kind of policies. So on one level we could say the client on some kind of layer of understanding was still the government at a large urban and regional planning scale. But in instance after instance, I would say like the kind of sheer intelligence of the kind of like countless numbers of money managers, kind of moving capital around the world in finding kind of new unforeseen territories of profitability would continuously like outmatch and outlogic the kind of good intentions of all of these sort of policies. So for instance, zombie hotels, that's a term, that the Irish invented to describe this phenomena that they find all over their landscape. And so the government actually, constructed an incentivization program that was conceived at a certain point where the tourist industry in Ireland was growing and there wasn't enough hotel rooms. And, because of how, what we can now tell with hindsight 2020, there were some problematics in how the law was constructed and some major loopholes that allowed corporations and real estate investors to take advantage and produce unforeseen outcomes. But you can go on in the list of these things. In Spain, for instance, in the community of Valencia, the state of Valencia, the province, if we want to use our North American kind of terminology, There was a huge housing shortage, and the left-wing government sought to remedy the problem that they perceived was a product of the kind of vestiges of agricultural land ownership models in Spain. So it was highly fragmented in its ownership structure, many, many small-scale landowners. So they were like, what we need to do is we need to enable the redevelopment of land to produce more housing that will lower our housing costs and create affordability. So the left-wing government invented this new creature in the kind of production of the built environment that they referred to as the urbanizing agent. And the urbanizing agent is, like, I continue to be mind blown that this was created and still exists in Spain. And it basically gave the rights of expropriation to private entities. So private individuals and companies could become legally urbanizing agents and expropriate land from private landowners against their will to develop it however they saw fit. But this was produced by a left-wing government as a solution to affordability. It had completely the opposite result. Rampant development, totally disconnected from need in a context in which Northern European lending capital flowed in and accelerated land prices. So I think the client is this sort of public-private hybrid that my sense, though, is that the public part of the equation tends to be outmatched by the sheer numbers involved on the private side of things.
And Matthew, a quick question. Do you see...
Sorry for being too
No,
long.
no, it was an eloquent answer to which I have a pointed question. Do you see any local resonance in what you're talking about? Do you see anything happening in the city of Vancouver, our region, which seems similarly impelled? I'm particularly struck by the intention of a left-wing government to promote affordability, and yet the result was otherwise. Anything locally you'd care to comment on that seems like that?
Well, in a kind of similar way to maybe how Adrian Blackwell responded to that answer, I mean, I think there's no question that the characteristics and phenomena that I kind of label as asset urbanism can be found in Vancouver. I think there's a number of different ways to understand asset urbanism, if we use that term, and one is in terms of global drivers. So there are kind of conditions that work at a global scale, but they always meet with local particularities, and those local particularities are different from place to place. But clearly, I mean, I think, okay, maybe this is a overly iconoclastic thing to say, but for the sake of provocation, I think there's a compelling case a correlational case between how livability is actually being constructed in Vancouver and conceived in Vancouver, that it is not accidentally correlated to the fact that Vancouver is the second least affordable city by many metrics in the world after Hong Kong. And then I think the interesting question becomes, how do these well-intentioned and in many ways positive livability structures have as a surprising byproduct encoded into them, which is a sort of space of heightened liquidity and fungibility for real estate transactions within a global market.
Okay, thank you. You want to respond? Yeah. Then we'll move on to the next question.
It's making me feel a little bit fortunate in my profession that what I see is the 1% are doing all the building. And I have at least half a dozen clients who are in that 1%. But on the positive side, they are listening. They want to do things more sustainably. There's a percentage of them that are actually wanting to do the right thing and thinking of the end user and the citizen.
No. Only.
Well, who's the client? The client is lots of government clients, but there's the main body would be the person who has the money, and that's real estate investment trusts and pension funds and things like that. They ultimately are the client, but also, and very importantly, private equity. that's just extremely wealthy people in groups. It can go from 10 people worth $10 million who all pitch in $1 million each to people worth billions and they all pitch in $100 million each. And they go out and they rule everything. And if I may, I'll digress to an anecdote where I was in New York reporting to, I guess, the masters, and they would be the mortgage lending heads at Deutsche Bank and Bank of America and so on. And at lunch, presenting the little outer provinces. See, this is Alberta, this is British Columbia. What would you like to buy? And at the end of it, sometimes I'd ask the guy from the Bank of America, why do you guys fund such foolish projects? You're just funding endless, useless projects. And the person answered, well, we've got $1 trillion to place, and if I don't place that, I'll be replaced with someone who will. So who the client is money that wants a home.
I think that's a really very quickly, a very provocative way to put it. In my talk, I mentioned the idea of the giant pool of money, and that's a term that I sourced from other people that have used that term. And there's a quite remarkable piece of reporting that NPR did in the United States on the giant pool of money. And it's just a kind of, you've reminded me of it again in relation to how you described that, the $1 trillion has to go somewhere. And one of the things that was so provocative about this piece of reporting is that they kind of described the increased prominence of subprime lending and mortgage-backed securities as essentially a kind of mode of doing business that was a function of responding to a huge amount of money that had to go somewhere that was deemed to generate kind of returns. So it was a kind of demand that the money needed to go somewhere, and to supply that demand, the heightened mortgage-backed securities were essentially invented in the subprime to kind of meet that demand, so as a product of the money.
Okay, thanks. And Vancouver might be one of those destinations we all feel. Leslie.
So I have a question that is related to empty buildings and infrastructure. Until recently, I lived in Cole Harbour on the 19th floor of a tower, and I looked out for 4 years on a building that was in front of mine with the better view. And on the back of that building, the building was 20-some stories, and in 4 years, I think I saw 6 units that had lights on consistently. And one day I was driving home, and I found myself in a traffic jam north of Georgia Street. And it suddenly occurred to me that if all those units were occupied, oh my God, the infrastructure in the city would be nowhere near adequate to accommodate all those people with their cars. And so one question, this is very naive, this is not your area is not my specialty, but my question is, given that this is now such a fact, this global real estate market, and in certain cities can kind of count on these investors that are not living in the apartments that they're purchasing, is that having any influence on the way transportation planning and the infrastructure planning is being conducted? Is it factored in the fact that there are so many empty units?
I'm going to say very quickly, it may very well be, but I have yet to come across an instance where that had been taken into account. I think, this is a phenomena that we're all, of course, through the media, increasingly aware of. And I don't think that the kind of language and tools and sort of disposition to respond to it is yet to be established, because it is, increasingly prevalent, but so relatively new. So I have yet to come across it as a sort of factor that's taken into account.
Maybe he should talk about the gentleman.
No? That's all right. We'll move to the next question. A lot of people lined up.
Okay.
So, you, sir.
Hi. Between quite a few spreadsheets and lots of beer, my friends and I have concluded that the way that we do transit-oriented development and this asset urbanism to maximize the public good. It is completely incompatible. The way that we build TOD now, this is more of a comment, and please poke holes in it, but the way that we build transit-oriented development, we have this concept of location efficiency. We figure if you buy a home in this area, it's near a train station, let's say Commercial Drive, you're buying in that 20-story tower, may or may not go up. You're not actually going to use it, you're not going to maximize it because your jobs change constantly throughout your life. And then we have to ask ourselves, as planners, why are we not regulating the tenure? If we can get away from the speculative value and just focus on use value, okay, urban asset, or asset urbanism, it's a natural force. There's this money that's out there. You will never be able to build something that's based on use value. You'll never be able to build a tenant or rental tower that's 20 stories because you'll get outcompeted. Somebody will pay more, they'll buy more. So as planners, why aren't we, and completely ethical, like, whatever, why aren't we demanding that we have rental-only zoning? Because if this money is gonna outcompete any other type of use, we need to restrict the types of uses that are there. Because now it's completely incompatible. If you're renting, you're gonna maximize your space. You're gonna rent, you're gonna relocate. The cost of relocating is much lower than if you buy a home. So, yeah, it's more of a comment, and yeah.
It's a comment worthy of response, though. Maybe Richard might want to opt in on that one, if I put you on the spot a little bit.
Well, I'm not really getting what you're
Sorry.
getting at. Is it that maybe in terms of land tenure, you'd think that areas around a station should be on a permanent government land lease, maybe?
No, maybe
90
not that,
years?
but it should be zoned into rental only, or they should be sold as like an entire unit to, let's say, a pension fund. You can now buy it, and you can have either office or rental units. The idea of just building condominiums is it's a waste on
So
transfer.
it would be condominiums versus rental apartments?
Oh, not necessarily rental, but some sort of like of office or whatever.
Well, there's a great difficulty in controlling for use. One of the things that happened at all the transit stations was the region and the government wanted office buildings to locate near the transit stations, such as in Metrotown, but they got pushed aside by condominiums, which paid twice as much money. So they wound up having these huge condominium projects and no offices. So we would recommend, well, in order to try and fix that, create exclusionary zoning and say you can only put in office, but you can't, and they won't, and that is not going to happen. And,
but there is a desire to have rental units. I mean, you have ongoing returns. If you're a pension fund, it's guaranteed rent.
It's about half the value of condominiums.
Oh, I agree.
Yeah.
One quick thing. I mean, maybe this is overly obvious, but I mean, the first condominium to be built in New York City was a building called Saint-Tropez in 1965. Condominium is a legal construct that is actually in the grand history of cities new. It was invented. It can be uninvented. It can be striked out of the law books. If that was, I'm not suggesting that would be a good thing, but in theory, right? And I think it's useful to note, like the New York City example, because so up until 1965, that first condo, I mean, New York had a very deep, rich history of building multi-unit housing for luxury, wealthy owners. But that was all through a cooperative model. And Paul Goldberger, the architecture critic for Vanity Fair, has sort of made comments about how it's interesting how the cooperative model of tenure for wealthy investors now, from the vantage point of condominium, looks like something that is actually a legal structure that makes it very hard, or disincentivizes absentee ownership and like speculation, just because of the logics and legalities of how that works.
Yeah, Robert, and then we'll move on.
"300 miles away, we're having an explosion of apartment construction. Almost no condominium units are being built. So there's something very different about the market there, and for the first time attracting national money, but thank God not international money. I'm so glad we're regarded as dowdy and obscure after seeing what's happened in Vancouver. I wouldn't want my city to become part of an international asset market for real estate. But I think it's an interesting question. Why are there so many apartments being built in Portland, almost no condominiums?
And we will move on only after I make a short comment. I mentioned this book, Capital in the 21st Century by Piketty. I think it's relevant to the question of condominiums versus rental. If you read his, not even between the lines, if you read just the explicit thing he says is that, you know, you can do things like do rental housing, but the background trajectory is on affordability generally, because as wealth accumulates in small hands and they're looking for places to put it, what happens to everybody else is the way the market begins to operate is that everybody else gets every dollar extracted up out of their pockets, whether they're renting or owning. The price mechanism operates such that the level of your salary, and salaries have been static and generally going down against inflation. So the level of your salary relative to food, housing, and basically that's it. A roof over your head and housing and clothing for your back. Historically, consume basically 100% of your income, and the trend is in that direction. I hate to be depressing, but it does relate to this question of is it better to do rental housing? And I think in our town, we're looking at rental housing that's forced by policy that's going out at $2,500 for a 2-bedroom unit, and it's quite debatable whether or not that's enhancing affordability.
I'd still rather have a $2,500 apartment available on the market than no apartment at all.
No, I know that's the debate. I'm just all right. And Neil, and then Gordon.
Hi, yeah, I'm Neil McGray, here from UBC. This is going to come out like gobbledygook because it's a bit of a wicked problem, this whole thing. But you guys are painting this picture of a city as kind of an engine of consumption at this point, and not short of a shared social and cultural exchange enterprise. Vertical cul-de-sac towers that aren't being serviced by transit, or automated cars that kind of gloss over the problem of a car-oriented city. So you're kind of creating the suburbs turned on its side a bit. And to me, thinking about it, that continues to take away from maybe the original idea of a city, a place of real like social and cultural exchange, by putting everybody in shoeboxes and basically being trapped in a box between the places that you go and interact with in that one place. Can that be changed? Are we going over the waterfall? If so, what are the points of leverage that you think might occur to kind of shift that in the other direction? I don't know if that's a coherent question, but.
I think that people will always find their way, in a city to other people. And some city planners have done a really good job of trying to, I guess, enhance their city and make it marketable by encouraging the young urban design class to come to their city and also providing more amenities. I mean, Vancouver is a resort, so it has a ton of amenities. People want to come here. That's why they want to invest their money here. So in fact, the two of them may be reinforcing each other and not counterproductive.
I guess one of the things I was going to say is that Portland is not Vancouver is almost a product city at this point. It's kind of selling itself as a bit of a product. And something like Portland, which everybody really appreciates visiting, but maybe doesn't take that model and go with it fully. Like I said, everybody appreciates that, but it's not a model that gets duplicated. So there's kind of a difference between this exchange city and this product city.
I like talking to students because you're responsible for the future. I won't have to live in it, but I do care deeply about it. I don't think we will pay attention to the fact that our urban civilization is not sustainable at a very fundamental level. We will not pay attention until it is really blatant and difficult. So what I think happens between now and then is that there's more and more people who understand the scale of the problem, that there are a variety of approaches. Not one of them will be selected. We'll blend, mix, and match. And we'll have some places that are doing experiments. At least in China, the experiments are deliberate. That's very interesting about that authoritarian government, deliberate experimentation. Not in this area, but in other areas. So what I think is important between now and the time when we realize that we're in a world of hurt, is to have people who have constructive ideas, who have made social connections, so that the instinct at the time of crisis is a good one and a constructive one. Because the instinct at the time of crisis, when it's a matter of resource constraints or the fact of income polarization, I think we're going to, maybe around the time I die, we're going to find that our food supplies are short. One of the instincts is extremely bad, which is nationalism, xenophobia, leads to killing people. Riots and revolutions occur at times of food shortages. It's not surprising. So I think that one of the jobs of students, while you're working on design and planning, is to saying, how do I build up a network of people who help understand the problem, who can have a constructive solution, so we can look forward to a global, sustainable urban civilization where people are fulfilled, but not at the risk of destroying the entire civilization. And between now and then, that's the work that really needs to go forward.
Okay, I want to go to Gordon then after that.
Robert, did you just load that up on that poor guy? This is getting good, Patrick. So Richard, infrastructure is the basis for, what did you say, the quality of life? More than that, I think. The economic viability of a city?
Yes, it's my opinion that, well, you would balance it that surplus infrastructure creates quality of life, and a deficit of infrastructure is a harder life. And that would be including all forms of infrastructure. Let's do a first category: hard, roads, water, sewer; soft, university, hospital, law courts; and third, natural infrastructure, something that isn't entirely degraded, that still offers a wilderness experience. Vancouver has a surplus of infrastructure right now, and it therefore offers a quality of life. What I was pointing to is the direction that Vancouver is going to with its next million people.
So we're going to make a vote. We're going to have a vote. Matter of weeks now. Do you think that's historic? Transit referendum, it's a bit more than transit. And is it designed to fail? Is it in fact to limit government's ability to have access to?
I'm not sure. I do know that the government, all the government departments have severely constrained budgets, and public revenues are modest, and there is just, everyone says there is no money, whether it's designed to fail or whether it's just its growth at any cost. We're just growing and we can't accommodate the growth, but we don't care because there's so much money to some people in growth.
I'd be interested in any of your comments on the transit referendum and the meaning of its failure, if indeed that happens. Strikes me as an historic moment.
Yeah,
finding one.
It would be inconceivable to not fund more public transit, and but here in British Columbia, I will say for those out of the province that it is a very, very backwards place. It's a hinterland, and it's got a very poor, tiny little economy, and very little growth, very little job prospects. So, and one of the things that they did recently here was there was a harmonized sales tax called HST, which is very logical because no one's paying any tax. And so they thought, well, let's get them when they buy their Mercedes-Benz and their Ferraris and other things like that. Be like everybody else who's given up on revenue from income tax and go after the harmonized sales tax. British Columbians were so foolish that they turned that back at the cost of billions upon billions of dollars. So I would put nothing past a group that would look billions of dollars in the face and turn it back, and look fairness in the face and turn it back. Absolutely incomprehensible. So I don't believe anyone's capable of anything anymore.
Well, that sounds like your answer. Adrian, you're at the phones, at the microphone.
So I have a follow-up question about infrastructure. I thought Paul's opening talk was very interesting, the two different case studies. One of them, the first one, I found somewhat terrifying. I mean, the economic logic of it was strange, as you clearly pointed out, but also the answer that an infrastructure is designed to provide security seemed like an argument about paranoia. Also, its incremental nature, the block by block nature of it, means that it can be rolled out by developers on a case-by-case basis, and it doesn't promise an infrastructure for everybody in the city of Port-au-Prince. On the other hand, the second example seemed quite interesting in its generalized application of a very economical infrastructural system. And it brought to mind a very provocative book, I think, written maybe about over 10 years ago, Splintering Urbanism by Stephen Graham and Simon Marvin, which says essentially that there's a new kind of infrastructure today, a splintered infrastructure. And they contrast that against Fordist mid-century infrastructures, which were deployed universally in a top-down way, essentially, at least as an idea, equitably to all citizens. While neoliberal post-Fordist infrastructures in their fractured and splintered forms are delivered on a pay-as-you-go basis, essentially. They're delaminated and they're highly differentiated amongst consumers. And I thought that basic topological difference was very interesting. It runs through all of your presentations. I mean, I thought Daniel's very interesting way of building a city plan out of dispersed infrastructure was very powerful. Didn't seem to quite stay in the space of dispersion, but tried to think about how the city gets pieced together. Matthew didn't talk explicitly about infrastructure, but clearly the financialization of infrastructure today is a huge issue. Blair started talking about the dispersed maker spaces and a kind of culture from the bottom up, but I didn't know how that would be universalized. Annalisa talked about the dispersed infrastructure of this car and how it would change everything. Richard seemed to be the one person who was standing up for a Fordist idea about infrastructure, an idea that the city might actually provide something for all of us. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that distinction and how you see a kind of topology of contemporary infrastructure working today.
I'll respond first to the Haiti and the block scenario. That's a heated debate on security, and if you go south of the United States, you see security and razor wires everywhere. At this charrette, we walked past 3 armed security guards to get to the studio. So it's a real life situation but what we talk about is securable, not that it's gated all the time, but say at night you can close the gates on it. The other reason that block structure costs more in total was that we designed it so it could plug in to a centralized system once enough blocks accumulated. So we were in some ways duplicating the infrastructure so that it could then become community-wise.
Daniel, do you want to speak to that?
You know, my sort of talk is very local, and but I think you could use this kind of strategy anywhere in the world with the stormwater, obviously, if it rains a lot. I think the basic message behind the talk was really actually about that we need to embrace the local people to understand the things we are discussing here. I think, and the best way to do this is maybe not through academic papers and discussions, but we need to go out there and actually put these things in place and get the local community enticed, understanding the seriousness and matter behind these issues, and really address it by actually experience that they can experience. For example, stormwater mitigation or any other environmental benefiting infrastructure in cities. I think it is our sort of duty in the field of research or environmental research to actually try to communicate this information to the people out there, and obviously through practical projects, but also maybe through enticing them to be part of it. So the strategy behind that idea of my talk was the the public needs to understand they need to also engage. It's not just the government who is going to do the job, they need to help and they need to pay for it too. So I think if they actually engage themselves in it, then maybe we will be more successful in making our city more engaging through the public, which I think is currently missing, particularly in this city.